Welcome back. We are now talking about the Assyrians. And the Assyrians are the biggest, meanest, nastiest bullies on the ancient block. And you will learn all about that as we continue. Now, the Assyrians emerged initially, there's basically two empire phases for the Assyrians. They emerged initially around 1350 and have about 150 years of being one of the brothers in the late Bronze Age trade network, right? They're one of the groups that is a powerful empire that is trading with these other groups, and also everybody's kind of afraid of them. Their name is taken from the city of Assur in northern Mesopotamia. And you can see that clearly on this map. So they got this nice 150-year empire, and then they decline just like the other major powers in the late Bronze Age. They are part of that late Bronze Age collapse. Unlike the other players, the Assyrians will re-emerge as a strong empire. Egypt continues to be a civilization. The Hittites basically disappear, and Babylon gets conquered by the Assyrians. So out of those big four, it is the Assyrians who really do the best during the Iron Age, though Egypt continues to be a civilization. They're just not an empire. And Babylon will be overran by Assyria and then re-emerge as their own empire in a little while. So again, Assyria is really the one that dominates the Iron Age. Now, again, this is a very pivotal time period in the ancient Near East. This is nothing new. We have been talking about this these last couple lectures. So this initial Assyrian empire wanes because of the Sea People. Israel emerges in Canaan. There's that big technological switch from bronze to iron, and just other new kingdoms emerge. Remember, when the cat's away, the mice will play, and the Assyrians are absolutely cats of history here. So this is a back and forth empire is what we're getting at here. But they will become extremely powerful when they make their comeback. Now, that takes place right smack dab in the middle of the Iron Age. Their Assyrian resurgence is right there in the middle of the Iron Age. And we call this the Neo-Assyrian Empire. For our quiz and test purposes, I will use it synonymously with the Assyrians. These are really the Assyrians I'm talking about. But if I say Neo in a question, it just means new. That's that bigger, more dominant Assyrian Empire. They will take over the largest empire to date. At its peak, it is bigger than any of the ones we have covered up to this point. They control all of Mesopotamia, large portions of Anatolia, also known as Turkey, all of Syria, Palestine, and even conquered the northern half of Egypt. So this is no small empire. And they become very adept, obviously, with all these conquerings. They're very adept at war. Very effective in battle. They make great use of iron weapons. And iron over bronze is a big deal that we should talk about at this point. You see, if I come at you with an iron weapon, a sword, let's say, and you come back at me with a bronze sword, you could have every speed, size, endurance, whatever kind of physical athletic advantage you can think of, and it probably won't matter because my iron sword is going to cut right through your bronze sword. Even more so if it's iron versus bronze armor. And so they have a major advantage over anyone that's still stuck using bronze when they're using iron. They also are excellent at siege warfare, and they have a merit-based army. These are all important things that we will be discussing in this lecture. So this is a military society that is the strongest we've seen up to this point. And really, I think in the ancient Near East, in the Eastern Mediterranean, only really Sparta is as militant as these guys. And this is the empire in all its glory during its heyday, to its largest extent. So you can see we have the Assyrian homeland. They'll conquer west, where the Hittites used to be, but not all of it, right? This right here, they don't conquer. And they'll conquer down into Syria, Palestine. They'll conquer Israel. They leave Judah as a vassal state. That's the southern kingdom that we talked about in the last lecture. They'll leave this as a vassal state, but they have to pay tribute, and they better keep the Assyrians happy or they will invade like Sennacherib did. And they even conquer the northern part of Egypt. So again, massive empire. Oh, and they conquer Babylon. From here on out, Babylon and Assyria's fortunes are basically linked. Whichever one controls Mesopotamia will have an empire for the next several centuries. All right, so with that said, let's talk a little bit about these people and their empire, not just in terms of the broad, territory acquired, but what it was like living there. The two big cities in Assyria are Assur and Nineveh. Now, Nineveh should be a name you know from your Sunday school classes and your youth groups, and if you're a Bible-believing, Bible-reading Christian, Nineveh is famous for being the city that Jonah does not want to go to. And he's swallowed by the giant fish because he's trying to avoid preaching to these people. And you'll see why. The Assyrian cities are characterized by constant strife. And before they emerge as an empire, they fought amongst each other, which is one reason why it takes them a while to become an empire again. But that also makes them very much battle tested and again, really good at war. Their army also, and this is one of their great achievements, this is I think, their biggest legacy. There's two. This is one of them. Their army was based on merit, skill, and bravery, not class. In other words, their army is based on how good of a soldier you were, not your nobility or your upbringing or who your dad was. Now, of course, there are definitely people who are nobility that are going to be promoted, and I'm sure not everything is fair. But in an era when most armies are basically led by a few well-trained elites and then a bunch of peasants, the Assyrian army rolls up with their skill, merit-based army that's battle-tested, and all of them are effective in fighting, and they have incentive to do even better because they can actually be promoted and not just go back to farming. That's a huge advantage. I mean, they're just much, much better at it than most of their opponents, if not all of their opponents. So that's where they're very unique. They have similarities with some of our other cultures that we've talked about in how they view the king. He's the protector of the people against the forces of nature, just like the Egyptian king is supposed to keep Ma'at by conquering chaos and disorder, so must the Assyrian king conquer the forces of nature. Both Egyptian and Assyrian kings like to talk about how they go on lion hunts, and they'll sometimes show us that in the artistic record. And I'll skip the next bullet because we just did that on the map, but that's there for you in writing if you need to pause the video and make sure you spell these places and everything else. Their other big legacy is that last bullet. So you have the army based on merit is big legacy 1. Big legacy 2 is extensive historical records. And I want you to make sure you add this in your notes. Don't just write down what's on the slides only. Please write down what I say as well, and if you need to pause it, have at it. But they kept records of things like astronomical observations. And what they would do is they would have an official who kept a detailed list of who the officials are in each capacity in government in a given year. And then in that year, they will say, this is the year of such and such big event. Sometimes it's, oh, this is the year that we conquered the Philistines. This is the year that we conquered Urartu. This is the year that we invaded Judah. This is the year that the sun was blocked out by the moon. Ah, a solar eclipse. Well, scientists can work backwards and tell you exactly when that happened, like one that happened August, I believe, 15th in 763 BC. This is crucial to every date that I've given you in this course, because all we have to do is sync up the records and the years given for the king's reigns in different cultures that we know contacted the Assyrians, and then compare it to that astronomical observation, and voila, presto changeo, rearrangeo, here are our dates. We do this called relative chronology. It's all relative to the astronomical observations that the Assyrians recorded. So they are a bedrock for our ancient chronology, and that's a pretty impressive legacy, and it's very, very detailed. This is a whole different ballgame in terms of the kind of records they kept. Pretty impressive for their day. And here you are hunting lions. I get a kick out of this. He's just like, okay, I've already shot the lion in the face, and now I'm going to walk up to it and I'm just going to grab it by the neck and stab. Actually, he's not even doing that. He's more like, grab it by the neck and stab. It just looks so bored. Shouldn't this look more exciting? I mean, he's hunting a lion. Not that I'm advocating it, but he clearly, he didn't just go up there that bored. But they're so used to it that, it's ho-hum, it's mundane. I'm the Assyrian king, and even a lion hunt isn't really that big of a deal for me. They are macho to the extreme in their art. Now, Assyrian foreign policy is going to be a bit of a can of worms here. This is a thorny topic because the simple truth is they are brutal. to the people they conquered. Almost every single time, they treat them terribly. Their homeland does not support a large population. Northern Mesopotamia is much rockier than southern Mesopotamia, where we started our class, and so they can't quite produce as much food and can't quite support as large a population. Therefore, when they carve out this empire with their expert military, going right alongside it, hand in hand, is a brutal reputation that they use to keep the peace. They want to make it so nightmarish if you rebel against them that you'll never think of doing it again. Or if you saw that group over there rebel, you're like, whoa, whoa, I cannot believe the Assyrians did that to those poor people. We better behave. That's their goal. To that end, they practice 4 incredibly harsh treatments of conquered regions. I don't know why the font is white here, but I think you can read it still. Number 1, they deport them. They're the first empire to practice this on a large scale. So what they do is they will conquer a region and they will take a huge chunk of the population and just resettle them in a different part of the empire. This is clever, it's a punishment, and it makes it really hard to rebel because who's in charge of the rebellion? We mixed you up with a bunch of other people that don't speak your language. Maybe you hated each other several years back, and now no one can rebel. You don't know where you are. You don't know the language of your next, group of people that you're living next to. And they very cleverly have made it very hard to throw off Assyrian rule. That's the integration, right? So they deport them, they integrate them. That makes it a multi-ethnic population with less nationalistic sentiment, right? Less, I am Syrian, let me rebel against the Assyrians, or I am an Israelite, I'm going to rebel. No, wait a minute, I have to work with them. Forget it. So it's a really clever system. It's also pretty devastating to think of your whole life uprooted, but it's nothing compared to these other two. Slavery. This is typical of ancient kingdoms, right? They constantly capture prisoners of war. Egypt's done this from the New Kingdom on. Hammurabi did this. The Syrians do this. The Persians will do this. The Romans, boy, they are definitely famous for doing this. It's mostly prisoners of war and people who are in debt that end up slaves in the ancient world. It's not based on race like slavery in America was. And so when we say slavery in this class, we have to make sure we kind of unpack that. It looks quite a bit different in terms of race than it did in the early part of American history, but it's still essentially a totally unacceptable violation of human rights, of course. And the idea for the Assyrians is to get a cheap labor force to do their building projects, and so it's a terrible fate. But even then, number 4 is still worse. They will do very, very discomforting things to the rebellious vassals. So if you were a vassal, if you were part of the empire and you rebelled, they're not shy about impaling you. That's where they kill you by shoving a stick up your stomach or the rectum. I'm not kidding. That's actually what they did. They will stick fish hooks in a king's nose and pull him along like a dog on a leash. They will flay people, which is where they cut layers of skin off while they're alive until they're dying. They're basically tortured to death. I mean, this is, of course, incredibly terrible, disturbing stuff. But their purpose is to terrorize them into obedience. And one of the things I want you to think about here is, would this have been effective, and to what extent? Can you perhaps imagine a scenario where for every city that's like, okay, whoa, we got hi Assyria, yeah, we like you too, that cooperates, is there one that is like, I know they're jerks, I know they're going to deal harshly with us if we don't pull this off, but I can't live another day under this empire. So for every group that maybe capitulates, there's a group inspired to rebel, and they deal with rebellions. I can say this because I know that they deal with rebellions almost every single year. In the time when kings go to war after winter, in early spring, the Assyrians, there they go again, off to make a statement about somebody else who's rebelling. And what does rebelling look like? Mainly not sending tribute and taxes. And they'll come show up your city and demand it. And if you're dumb enough to not give it to them, then they will besiege your city and do all these awful things to you. But apparently they really were disliked, because even despite all this, many groups still rebel year after year. Here's the siege at Lachish again. We showed you more or less from like here over previously. I remember we got this kind of violence. We got guys with spears. We got the impaling. I'm going to rehash the whole thing in the interest of time, but this is a good example of the kind of brutality that they will show you in the artistic record. It's not always brutal, though. Here we see them bringing back musicians who are presumably going to go back and serve in the emperor's court. And they basically play a string type instrument, and maybe they're providing music along the walk. So if you're valuable enough, if what you do really matters to them, the fate's a little better. But still, make no mistake, these are prisoners being moved against their will to be forced to live elsewhere. Other Assyrian sources show kings groveling before them. So here we have Jehu, son of Omri, an Israelite king, bowing before Shalmaneser. He's right here. And he's basically saying, please be kind to me. I am your vassal. And he's doing so to avoid having his eyes gouged out or having a fish hook placed in his nose. You can see the string as the king leads them along. And now he's just, ho-hum, gouging out some guy's eye. Right? So this is the kind of people that Jonah has in mind when he flees from what God wants him to do and doesn't want to preach to them. And yet, I want to point it out, in his infinite wisdom and mercy and grace, God still wants these people to have a chance at repentance. I mean, they're the worst of the worst up to this point in our course, for sure. But God's grace is still sufficient. And Jonah then preaches to them finally. Many of them repent, and he's mad at God that God would actually save the Ninevites, the Assyrians that live in Nineveh. And he goes and he pouts under his, palm tree or his beanstalk. It's kind of the impression you get, but he goes and he pouts. And God's like, what's the matter with you? He's like, how dare you save them? Jonah hates them because of all of these things. And it's a very human thing to react to an enemy this way, but yet God still reaches out to them. And it's a powerful statement. As far as their emperors or kings, there's only one I'm really truly concerned with you knowing beyond what we talked about with 701 BC, and that is Tiglath-Pileser. He's one who really starts this whole thing. When he came to power, Assyria was actually still in their decline phase. They were dominated by their neighbors, who are people called the Urartians, who basically are forgotten in history because the Assyrians defeat them and off go the Assyrians. He is also the one who made it a merit-based society. And please know this for short answer, potentially on the exam or a discussion post. There's a lot of ways we can work this, but when we talk about it being merit-based, we went over that earlier. Make sure you've got that this is an advantage in a number of ways. Rewind the video if you need to go back and check that, but make sure you're ready to roll with that kind of a question. Other scenes are kind of funny and grisly all at the same time, despite their initial appearance. This looks pretty peaceful, right? Assurbanipal is the king. He's just chilling on his recliner futon thing. And his wife is here. She's got a cup to drink, so does he. There's grapes growing up above them. They probably have wine in their glasses. He's got fan bears here. Right here's the grapes, right? These people are playing music. You got some beautiful trees here. And then over here, ruining, from our perspective, this idyllic garden scene is a human head. This is a man named Temu who had, I guess, rebelled, for lack of a better word, against Assurbanipal. So he marched off with his army, defeats him, kills him, brings his head back and says, look, honey, let's have a nice, calm party in the garden. We'll hang up the head in the tree. And she's like, oh, great, dear, that sounds wonderful. But this is what they do. You think it's a nice, serene, romantic little scene. It's kind of humane and touching. It sort of strikes a nice chord, and then you see the human head hanging from a tree, and you're like, oh, right, still the Assyrians. So by now, I'm sure you can understand Jonah's reluctance to go to Nineveh. All right, at this point, I want to switch gears for a second. I told you from time to time we would try to make sure to talk about gender. It's not always available in our sources in the ancient world, but this is an important topic whenever we do have good sources, and I want to talk about women in Assyria. Women in Assyria are treated much worse than they were in Egypt. Remember, in Egypt, we talked about they had divorce rights, they had property rights, there's really powerful priestesses, and the occasional queen. In Assyria, they are wholly dependent on their husbands and fathers. Before that, they could be severely punished for all sorts of things, and it's very brutal and ridiculous, just like most of the Syrian punishments of their vassals. For example, a woman caught stealing would either have her ears cut off by her husband or her nose cut off by the victim of the theft. So imagine your wife is caught stealing and they catch her and they say, okay, would you like to cut your wife's ears off? Not particularly, no. Okay, well then here's the victim. He's going to cut her nose off. Hey, whoa, 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 wait. I guess I'll cut her ears off. I mean, who does this? This is just, of course, brutal. That's the theme of the lecture here. Married women had to cover their heads in public, while unmarried women, slaves, and prostitutes are forbidden to cover their heads. A prostitute who violated this rule would be given 50 lashes, potentially have her clothing taken. How many clothes? I mean, how many outfits do you think she has? Right? And then maybe even have hot pitch poured on her head, scarring her for life, if not outright killing her, just for breaking the head covering rule in Assyria. In the palaces, access to women was monitored, and outsiders had to be checked to see if they were castrated or not. And any male who's not the king is actually a eunuch in Assyrian palaces. And you see that in the art. The guy behind the king in the scene with the lion, that was a eunuch, for example. So pretty harsh place to live. Women also had to wait 2 years to remarry if their husband became a prisoner of war, if he was actually one of the ones captured in battle by the enemy. If he came back, then their marriage is back on. If she happens to have children in the meantime, they stay with their father. So she basically has no rights to those children at that point, even though the whole event was really not her fault. So this is a very different world, even though it's the ancient world still, than Egypt when it comes to the treatment of women. And it's quite sad. So naturally, this empire does decline. I almost want to put a thankfully on that. Again, there's two things that did really well that we talked about, but boy, it's hard to teach you guys about them without making these kind of judgment calls about their very brutal behavior. Their peak was about 640. 30 years later, they're no more. Right? It's longer than that, but in terms of their peak phase, the most territory gained, within 30 years, there's no more empire. They have a very unstable throne. They're always in fighting about it. There's always kings trying to take the throne from each other. You could claim, and I think this is interesting and possible, that this is a consequence of the merit-based army, actually, is that a commoner rises up, says, hey, I'm better at this than you, takes out a lieutenant, takes out a general, becomes a powerful general, thinks, you know, I could probably do a better job than the king. So there's always this competition. The structure is also unstable. The home region's just too small. And they're ultimately taken out by a tag team effort of the Babylonians and the Medes. Now, the Medes will basically become the Persians, and Nineveh is sacked in 612 BC. The king runs, and he holds out for a couple years in another city, and then by 610, the Assyrians are no more. All right, we will talk Babylonians next time, and it will be a short and sweet lecture.